Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I call this episode the French UFO Wave of 1954, the Humanoids. This is an episode I've wanted to do for a very long time, but honestly, this series of events that occurred in September and October of 1954 is so incredibly complex and intense that it's really daunting. It quite intimidated me trying to figure out all these cases. So what I've done is concentrated solely on the humanoid reports because honestly, in that period of 2 months in 1954 in France, there were well over 1,000 sightings over a 60-day period. It began a little bit before September and continued after October, but those 2 months are the heart of one of the most intense UFO waves in human history. Something very strange happened there, and I'm trying to figure out what exactly is the reason for this 2-month-long, super intense wave of sightings and landings and humanoid reports in France. Why France? Why those 2 months? So this is something that has been studied quite intensely. I think this is a very well-known UFO wave. If you don't know about it, you certainly should. That is another one of the reasons I wanted to do this episode today. And I'm going to concentrate only on the humanoid reports for a couple of reasons. I think sightings are limited in the amount of information they can provide us. They're certainly important, and there's so many of them, it would take days, honestly, to cover them. And the humanoid reports are just far more interesting. I think they contain a lot more information and really have a lot to say about the ETs, who they are, where they come from, why they're here. And boy, there are a lot of them in this French wave. So I am going to present about 50 cases of humanoids in chronological order as they occurred through the months of September and October in France. And I have to tell you, the cases I'm covering are just the tip of the iceberg. There's probably close to twice as many, but some of these reports aren't super reliable. They were reported only in newspaper articles and weren't officially investigated. So I'm trying to concentrate on the most credible cases, cases that were investigated, cases that had multiple witnesses, cases that had physical evidence, or something to really back them up. And boy, there are so many. I will say that the researchers who have really focused on this include Jacques Vallée, certainly, a very early and pioneering French researcher. It was Aimé Michel who did most of the research, I think, but there are many researchers who looked into this. Patrick Gross, certainly. Albert Rosales covered it and documented it in quite some depth in his amazing multi-volume books, Humanoids Amongst Us. So certainly a lot of researchers have looked into this, but it's such an interesting series of events that I think it deserves a second and closer look and see if we can figure out why France? Why September and October of 1954? What was going on at that time? What does this wave mean? So, a lot of cases I want to cover. This is going to be a pretty long episode. Let's get started. It was on September 10, 1954, in Beaujeu. This was around 8:30 p.m. when Monsieur Antoine Mazaud, a farmer, was returning to his house from his fields and came upon a strange man standing about 4,500 feet from his farm. This is less than a mile. The man was human-looking, about average height, but wore a strange helmet and was dressed in clothes, much like a motorcyclist. Antoine held up his pitchfork at first, but sensed no danger and put it down as the figure approached him. Antoine said good evening, but the man didn't respond other than to reportedly bow. He shook Antoine's hand, hugged him, and then walked off. At this point, Antoine still thought that this was just a normal farmer, until suddenly he heard a noise and looked up to see a cigar-shaped craft about 18 feet long, which took off with a soft buzzing noise and was gone. So at this point he realized this was not a farmer. and was quite shook up. He told nobody about his wife and told her not to speak about it to anyone, as they would, quote, make fun of me. But of course she did share it with their neighbors, and word spread quickly. And this experience ended up becoming widely publicized with many newspaper articles, which were actually inaccurate. And here's the problem. The French word for hug and kiss, embrasser, it's the same word. And this led to confusion about what happened. And most of the newspaper articles said that this figure, this alleged E.T., walked up to Antoine and kissed him. But that's not actually what happened, according to Antoine, and he describes in his own words. As he says, after he saw this figure, he says, "I then distinguished a man who went towards me. He walked while lowering his head. He approached me, shook my hand, withdrew his helmet, made out of metal, a sort of head protection like motorcyclists use, but deprived of a chin protection. Then he gave me a hug without ever raising his head. He did not even make a sound. Perplexed, I dropped the fork which I carried on my shoulder, and the man quickly engaged in the field. I was like paralyzed. With a friend at my side, perhaps we would have followed him. Recovered from my emotion, my glance was then attracted by an oblong mass, which slowly took altitude and which shone slightly. This thing appeared to pass under the power lines, which borders the road. Its profile did not exceed 6 meters in length. You can question me 100 times, and 100 times I will answer the same thing, because I do not lie." So that was the first case, which started to slide under the radar until this next case, and this is the case that really grabbed the country's attention. This one occurred same night, September 10, and this was at 10:30 p.m. in the town of Quarry. And the main witness is Marius de Wield. He heard his dog howling, as he says, enough to awaken the dead. So wondering what was going on, he grabbed his flashlight and opened the door, at which point his dog came crawling in on its belly, apparently so frightened it could barely walk. And it was then that Marius saw what was frightening his dog. An object had landed on the train tracks right next to his house. So Marius approached to within 20 feet and is trying to figure out what the heck this object is when he heard footsteps behind him. He swung his flashlight around, and at this point he saw 2 figures under 3 feet tall wearing metal helmets. And at that moment, a beam of light was emitted from the object, from the craft on the railroad tracks, and this beam of light struck him, leaving him paralyzed, caused his flashlight to stop working. At this point he could see a door opening in the craft, and these beings ran by him and boarded the craft, which took off while changing colors. So this is a very well-known case. I'd just like to quote the witness directly. As he says, "I went out with a flashlight and then saw about 6 meters away a dark shape, which I took for a wagon of farmers abandoned in the fields. While my beast continued to bark, I saw small beings coming out of a nearby path. They were running towards the crossing, but the 2 beings in a hurry almost brushed against me. The beam of my lamp illuminated the head of one of them. I was dazzled by a reflection like that which can emit a glass object. Almost immediately the door of the machine opened, closed, and then the ladder rose about 10 meters after oscillating for a moment. A very bright light burst forth like a flash of magnesium, and the saucer, like a ball of fire, took the direction of the west." So he was really startled by this. He ran home and informed his wife and neighbor, neither who saw anything, but they did call the police, who interviewed the witness and believed him due to his intense fear. So by sunrise, actually, numerous investigators were already investigating the location of the landing and were actually inspecting the train tracks when a train showed up and became stuck exactly where this object had landed, stuck on their tracks. And an inspection of the tracks showed that there was an 18-foot wide depression on the railroad tracks themselves. And under the tracks rocks were found which looked like they were carbonized by a very high heat, and the sleepers between the steel lines were also marked up. The main witness felt quite unwell for some time after the encounter, and it turned out that numerous people in the area also saw UFOs and beings in that area on the same day. So this case was primarily investigated by Aime Michel, also Jacques Vallée. And as it turned out, he had another encounter about a month later, in which his 4-year-old son and he were walking near his home, and he saw another craft landed on the ground nearby the railroad tracks, this time about 150 feet away, and he walked carefully towards them, remembering what happened last time, and he saw a little door opened in the craft, a row of windows around the cupola of this saucer craft, and several short humanoids. And one of them, who he sensed was the leader, actually approached Marius and his infant son, stood several feet away. Now these were just little guys, about 1.2 meters, just over 3 feet in height, and wore a helmet again, which had a transparent faceplate. But this time he got a good look at their face, and he says they looked almost Asian. They had sort of a sharp chin and pointed cheeks, and what looked like hair, jet black hair, brown eyes, and sort of bronze skin. And this humanoid made a friendly gesture, actually patted Marius's son, who at this point he was carrying in his arms, tapped Marius on the back several times, smiling, said several unintelligible words, and actually grabbed a chicken, which he gave to one of the other humanoids, and patted Marius on the back, and then walked over to the object and walked in, and this object took off towards the east. Now there are some who feel like this might be an exaggeration or perhaps even a hoax. Hard to say. Certainly his first encounter had lots of physical evidence, but it's the only case I found in which someone saw humanoids twice, and it was this case which really started this whole French wave in terms of humanoids. And it was just day after this. It was actually about 9 days later, on September 19, in Senon, this is near Vienne, that a farmer by the name of Yves David, 28 years old, was driving his moped on the roads between Senon and Vineyard. This was around 10 p.m., and suddenly the strange prickly feeling came over his body, which he said was like an electric shock, and it got so bad he stopped and got off his moped. Now his moped the headlight was functioned by pedal power, powered by the power of his pedals, so he was now in the dark. And as Yves says, the headlight of my moped did not function very well, and suddenly I could see a mass in the middle of the road. My surprise was great when I saw a kind of cuirass advancing towards me. This is a figure sort of wearing armor. And as he says, this figure stopped at my height, stroked my arm, emitted some inarticulate sounds, and I did not move. Then he retreated, and only a few yards away I saw a machine which I cannot describe. A green light appeared which paralyzed me, and I was unable to move. The craft rose from the ground at the vertical and disappeared without any noise. So you can see the drawing of the craft here, which he had difficulty describing. But this witness, Yves, was shocked so badly he couldn't stop shaking as he recounted what happened, and he was afraid to actually tell the police and had friends do it, because, as he says, I was afraid if I spoke to be scoffed. He didn't think anyone would believe him, but he wanted to know if anyone else had seen anything. And the wave had officially begun, because it was also on that night in Autanville, this is near Moselle, a city councilman, who is not named, had arrived at home when he saw an object landed in a field near his home, and he saw a figure standing next to the craft. So he was curious and walked up to this figure, hoping to speak with him, but this figure saw him approaching, quickly went into this craft, which was 4 days later, September 23rd, of course still 1954. This next encounter occurred in Michelin, and the witness is 42-year-old Marcelin Roadside. He owned a vineyard, and he was driving down the 629 road, and he saw a man coming out of what he thought was another vehicle and stand in front of the road, kind of blocking the road. And looking at this situation, Marcelin thought that there must be a car accident and this was an overturned vehicle. But looking at it, he saw it was egg-shaped and was covering the entire width of the road and glowing brightly. And this man was not dressed normally, in sort of a cloak or a poncho that went from the shoulders all the way to the ground. Still confused about what was happening, Marcelin started to approach to help. And at this point, the man walked right up to him and prevented him from stepping any closer to this craft and started speaking in a foreign language. At this point, another figure appeared, and as Marcelin, the witness, says in his own words, "I tell you, one is rather surprised than anything else." And at that moment, they both left. I didn't see where they were going, neither by a door, nor I expected that they would get in their device. They got into it. I heard a noise like the rustling of a tent canvas, a flight of partridges going away, but not from its motors. See, it rose vertically, quite quickly, and when it was at a certain height, a distance, I won't tell you, but it was not excessive, maybe 200 meters, not even. So at that moment, it went straight north, but like an arrow. So this, he realized it was not normal, and later, investigating the area, he did find what looked like a small piece of metal, which was evidently sent to Paris for analysis, and the report came back that it was terrestrial iron. This is not well verified. I could not find the actual report, and the sample was not returned. But this is when things started to get really busy, because it was the very next day that there was another landing involving a humanoid. This was on September 24 in the town of Diege near Burgundy, and it was 9 a.m. in the morning when Miss Simone Jeffrey saw a flying saucer in a clearing in a field. She said it was 35 feet in diameter, kind of elongated with a dome on top, and right behind it she could see a dark-complexioned man wearing a strange uniform and sort of a skull cap. He was looking at her, and this freaked her out. She rushed away. But at this point, Miss Giselle Finn, a shepherd, also heard barking, and her dogs led her to this clearing, and she had to restrain them from attacking this apparently same figure who had his back to her and was leaning on the craft. So this was two witnesses to apparently the same incident. 1 day later, September 25th, another landing with a humanoid at Joinville-le-Pont. This is near the Val de Marne. The witness is Louis Perret and his friend, who's not named other than Monsieur D. They were walking along the banks of the Marne River around 9:35 p.m. and I'll just let Louis describe what happened. As he says, a craft descended vertically and landed noiselessly 20 meters from us. Two beings came down, two strange characters, about 1 meter 10 centimeters. So again, just over 3 feet tall. And he said their faces were covered with hair. As I was immobilized by the ray, one of them rushed at me and pulled off my trousers, which may seem incredible to you, and yet there were two of us. My friend shouted, and the two Martians climbed into the machine, which rose vertically. So this is a strange case, to say the least, pants-stealing ETs. And there are some researchers who have written this off as a hoax. However, the witness says he has another witness, and there are many cases in the literature, certainly, where people are undressed by ETs. But this one is definitely a little bit of an outlier. This next case occurred on September 26, so it's just one day later. This is at the town of Chabure, and the witness is Mademoiselle Labouffe, who heard her dog Dolly barking, as well as all the other dogs in the neighborhood. And looking outside, she saw a figure which she said looked kind of like a plastic-clad scarecrow. And then, as soon as she saw this figure, it darted away, and this is when she saw a disc actually take off from the ground. And I will just quote Mademoiselle Labouffe directly. As she says in her own words, "I was in the path. I was picking up mulberries in the hedge. Suddenly my dog started to bark. I turned over and saw the animal. The hair raised, frozen in front of me, seemed to be a scarecrow. I moved towards the dog to prevent it from barking, and at this point in time the scarecrow advanced towards me. It was a small being. It hardly measured more than 1 meter. I had the impression it was a kid locked up in a cellophane bag. What struck me was its very human face. But fright took me. I yelled and hastened to throw myself in the hedge. I do not know how much time I remained there. From there, I saw the corn, but there was nobody anymore. Then a circular craft of 3 meters in diameter, approximately, thick about 50 centimeters, took off from behind the corn. The craft flew away initially in skew. It did not go fast. It made the noise of a spinning top, which whirs, and I also heard a whistling sound. The craft then changed from a horizontal position to a vertical position. It rose straight up at tremendous speed. Passers went by and saw me in the hedge, worried about my paleness. A little bit recovered from my fright, I told them what I had seen and led them to the place where I had seen the flying saucer take off. As you can note, there is on the ground a clearly visible circular print. So this shocked her to the degree that Mademoiselle Labouffe actually developed a fever. This case was very well verified, and landing traces were clearly visible to researchers. The same day, September 26, according to Aime Michel, minutes after a sighting reported to a local radio station, a short humanoid in a weird sort of diver's suit was seen by another witness, a Monsieur Gouillard, at the Chaillet airport. He said it waddled in a weird sort of fashion towards his craft and got into it. It was a typical saucer-shaped UFO, and it took off, and a 10-foot wide circle was found at the landing site. One day later, September 27, there was 3 separate landings. The first occurred at Saint-Do, this is near Figeac. 3 children were walking to school in the morning along Road 13 and saw a short figure in a red suit, and they could hear it speaking in a strange language. They were right next to it, about 10 feet away, and they watched this figure as it walked into sort of a box-shaped craft. One of the children, her name is Arlette, said this object took off vertically. Now the children did tell their teacher, who called the police. The police showed up and investigated the site of the landing and didn't find any evidence. And then they questioned all 3 witnesses separately, who stuck to their story. The other witness, Nicole, who's 10 years old, said that the man was just about over 3 feet tall, bald-headed, and was wearing a red suit and holding what she thought was a rifle, which she said he fired twice, which this is what really frightened them and made them run off. They said the craft was very small, about 3 feet wide. I suspect it's probably bigger, but the witness, being so young, was not good at estimating. But later, returning from school on the same route, she apparently saw the same man and same craft again, which took off. And the other witness, age 8, gave the same details, sort of echoing what the first witness said. And the teacher wrote all of this off as a hoax, and investigators are kind of divided as to this case's authenticity. But I don't know, so many cases going on, could very well be real, because there was another case that day. It was afternoon. This is at La Sue, Perpignan. An anonymous high school student was walking to school when he came upon a rounded craft landed. And two beings described as, quote, grotesque little creatures, he says, came out, looked around, and then went back inside the craft, which immediately took off. He ran home, trembling in fear, and in fact he was so afraid he was inconsolable and had to be put to bed. A doctor was called who diagnosed the witness as having a nervous breakdown. So, I mean, it just gets stranger from here on. It was the same night, September 27, when there was another very well verified landing in humanoid account in Jura. In this case, there are 3 witnesses, all young children. Janine Romand was 9 years old. She was the first to see something in their yard, and she shouted out to her brother, Raymond. She said, "Come quickly. There is a phantom wandering in the yard." Now, they'd never heard of ETs or UFOs. At this point, Raymond, who was 12 years old, could hear the dog barking furiously, went outside, and saw a 6-foot-tall metallic figure about 30 feet away. It frightened him. He ran inside, but became curious and went back outside and saw that this figure had moved slightly closer from its original position. So he bent down, picked up a few large pebbles, and threw them at the being, and could hear those pebbles clanging against the metal surface of this kind of robotic-looking being. So at this point, he went back inside, grabbed his toy pistol, which shoots little darts, and shot at it. And again, he could hear the metal clanging. But it was at this point that he heard a loud noise, felt a blast of air, and a weird sort of coldness knocked him to the ground. He called it, quote, an ice-cold, invisible force. So he jumped up and fled into the house. Now, meanwhile, his sister, Janine, is watching all this, and she saw apparently another being advancing towards the house. She hid in the hay barn and watched as it came up to 3 feet of the front door, walking with this weird waddling gait. And at this point, the 2 younger kids also saw something else, a glowing sphere of red light about 600 feet away from the house, which was moving in a back and forth oscillating pattern. Suddenly, all at once, the metallic figure and the glowing sphere disappeared. But I'll just quote Raymond here, as he says, "We were playing with Janine in the barn. She was weird. She said, 'I saw a ghost. He does not make any noise.' I looked outside. I saw the thing. You would have said it's a sugar lump. It was not taller than me. I threw stones at it. I tried to approach, but I was thrown on the ground, and I was very cold." So when he says sugar lump, it looked kind of rectangular, but did have what appeared to be legs. As he says, it was weird and frightening. It did not have arms. It was very shining, about my size, standing on 3 feet. To chase it away, I picked up a stone that I threw at it. It resounded like a metallic sheet, but as it did not go away, I shot at it with my arrow gun. But then when I approached it, I received against me like a jet of icy fluid, which threw me off the ground. I shouted to Janine, "Run!" And it was at this time that the phantom moved away while being dangled on its 3 feet. So yeah, one more quote. He says, "I picked up the stones, I threw them, and one touched the thing with a noise like a metallic sheet. I shot at him with my arrow gun. As I approached, I felt an icy pressure which laid me down on the ground. We fled, and a few minutes afterward, we saw a red luminous ball, which moved while oscillating like a dead leaf, in a field at 150 meters from the farm, and it disappeared suddenly. So they didn't tell their parents. They freaked out. They didn't know what they were seeing. But at school the next day, they talked about seeing, quote, tin ghosts, and never having heard of UFOs or ETs or robotic figures. They didn't know what they were describing, but the teacher was impressed, called the police. The police showed up and interviewed the kids, who were still quite frightened. They went to the location and did find crushed vegetation where the kids had seen the glowing sphere. Also visible were 4 holes in the ground and a fir tree whose bark had been torn off. And according to one of the police officers, over a circular area about 12 feet in diameter, the grass was flattened counterclockwise, fixed in the motionless pattern of a whirlwind. Metal flowers within the circle looked as if they had been put through a press. So Raymond's parents were quite religious, particularly the mother, who punished him, saying, "Stop lying." But Raymond stuck to his story, and after being questioned by his parents, a teacher, the priest, and the police, none of the children ever varied their story. So it's quite an interesting case. Now, one day later, September 28, in the town of Bouzet, the witness, Mr. Mercier, had a very strange encounter. As he says, and I quote, "I had gone in the afternoon to pick grapes in my Grand Tertre vineyard. Discovering that thieves had been plundering the vines, I stayed until night, hoping to surprise them. Around 10:30 p.m., as I was getting ready to leave, I saw some kind of luminous mass falling from the sky about 50 yards away from me. I had no more than realized that I could not budge, that I was paralyzed, when I saw movement near the luminous thing. It was 3 men. I felt myself losing consciousness, and when I came to my senses, nothing was there anymore. Then I ran away, half crazy with fright." So this case was apparently never officially investigated, but did appear in a number of newspaper articles. And again, since it wasn't investigated, some researchers question its authenticity. But the wave was just really beginning at this point. It hadn't not reached its peak. 2 days later, there were 2 dramatic landings. And at this point, the press is starting to go crazy. And the whole country is buzzing with the reports of these craft coming down. It was in Toulouse when Mademoiselle X, who does not want to be named, went outside to retrieve her laundry because it was starting to rain. And she says she saw 2 shiny discs landed in the field behind her house. She called her husband, and they both watched as 2 silver-suited, child-sized entities emerged from the discs, appeared to speak to each other, and then returned to their craft by moving right into them with no visible doorway. That is a pattern we see in many of these cases. They just move right in. Same day, it was 4:30 p.m. This occurred in Marcilly-sur-Vienne at a quarry. It was at 4:30 p.m. when 7 workers at this quarry, including the chief, Georges Gatet, were operating loud machinery, and he was overseeing the whole operation. And it was he, Georges, who first noticed a circular craft hovering about 3 feet above one side of the quarry. It was very strange in appearance. It appeared to have what looked like rotating blades like a helicopter, but clearly wasn't a helicopter. And work stopped as everyone turned to observe this craft, and right next to it there was this short, helmeted figure holding a tube-like device. And another device on his chest at this point emitted a powerful beam from its chest, striking apparently Georges, who was unable to move. Georges was the closest to this figure. And as he says, and I quote, "The man climbed back into his craft, with I being able to tell by where, and then the craft rose vertically in jerks, and a noise like the jet engines of fighter planes. At about 200 meters of altitude roughly, it emitted a fog that completely concealed it, and it disappeared before our eyes. If I had been alone, I would never have said anything about it. Now, in the days and actually weeks that followed, this main witness, Georges, who was struck by this beam of light, suffered from insomnia, headaches, and loss of appetite. Some of the other workers were interviewed who said, "We are not crackpots. We are sure of what we saw." Now, there was an attempted follow-up on this case by René Pacot. He was unable to locate any of the witnesses and believed it might have been a hoax. I'm not so sure. The next day, October 1st, there were 3 more landings in France, all involving humanoids. The first occurred at Ligecourt and involved 2 young men, Bernard Devoisin and René Condet. They were bicycling along the road when they saw, 450 feet ahead of them, a landed flying saucer, glowing orange and covering the full width of the road. It was sort of shaped like a haystack, they said, and next to it stood a very short, kid-sized figure. And as Bernard says in his own words, "At 100 meters, I realized it was a human being. You would have thought it was a diver. And I think without being able to say, because everything happened so quickly, it could have had a mask." So they decided to approach it closer and got to within about 210 feet when this figure disappeared into the craft and the craft took off, leaving them both somewhat shaken up. Same day, October 1st, near the town of Jussy, it was 7 p.m., when 2 men were outside of the town and saw a white disc-shaped object whirling around in the sky, and suddenly it drops down and lands just a short distance away. And as one of the witnesses says, "We then saw 2 men, dressed all in white, come out of it. They did not utter one word, but with great reinforcement of gestures, they beckoned to us to come to them. But we became frightened and we cut loose. A few seconds later, the machine took off and disappeared in the night." Now, here's the third case for that day. This occurred in Bergerac. And there's actually, I believe, 2 witnesses to this one. The first witness is Jean Labonne, as he says, "I was alone at home and came back from closing my gate. When I reached the entrance to my garden that ran behind the house to the railway, I saw posed on a strip of land of 3 by 5 meters a craft shaped like a mushroom. While the cap was dark, the body seemed to be made of plexiglass. It was luminous, and then, there in front of me, barely 3 meters away, seeming to forbid the path of my garden, was a shadow." So at this point, Jean shouted out, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" And as Jean says, "At the sound of my voice, the black shape turned back, slipped to the craft, and in a few seconds it rose to the sky, followed by a trail of light. I saw very clearly under the dome 3 crutches that folded. But my astonishment was not over yet. At dawn, I got up and returned to my garden near the place where I had seen the device. On the soil, I discovered 3 light footprints, but what disturbed me most was a bloom of black-stalked, long-stemmed mushrooms, unknown in the region, which had suddenly grown. I did not dare to touch them, and besides, they dissipated like dew at the first rays of the sun." So this is one of several cases where weird mushrooms will grow at the site of a UFO landing, perhaps because these spores are subjected to some type of radiation. Hard to say, but this does turn up in some cases. And unknown to him, his neighbor, Monsieur Defise, actually watched as this craft came down, stayed on the ground a few moments, and then take off. He was too far away to see this figure, but it's great confirmation of a landing. This wave is so amazing because the next day, very next day, October 2nd, there were 2 more landings. Mind you, there's all kinds of sightings going on at this point, hundreds. And this next landing took place at Ginchy in Yonne, France. This comes from Jacques Vallée, who says that at 7:45 p.m., the witness, Robert Couffaut, was plowing his fields with his tractor at a location known as Croix au Moin. And he was in an uncultivated field surrounded by undergrowth. And this field was pretty large, but in an isolated area. And he noticed 2 figures a few hundred meters away, and they were dressed strangely in white or clear-colored jumpsuits and appeared to be looking in his direction. And Monsieur Couffaut continued to plow his tractor, completing 3 circles in the field, but keeping his eyes on these strange figures, which apparently stayed in the same spot and were looking in the same direction. And moments later, these 2 figures disappeared behind a hedge, and he's continuing to work. It's now completely dark, and he's using the headlights of his tractor. And it was just a short time later, he saw where these 2 individuals had disappeared, a fiery-colored apparatus that flew over at an extraordinary speed towards the northeast and was out of sight within 4 or 5 seconds. He heard no sound, but his tractor was on, he says, so he couldn't be sure. But he estimates that this craft was about 15 feet long. And later, several local residents and a policeman inspected the field, but now found no traces of where this craft had apparently landed. Same time, same day, October 2nd, there was another landing with humanoids. This was at Croix d'Épine, 7:50 p.m., pretty much the same time, when Ernest Delattre, a 19-year-old mechanic, was driving his motor scooter and saw a glowing object overhead suddenly drop down and land about 600 feet ahead of him, right alongside the road. Said it was amazing because it changed colors, it came down and landed, and he drove right up to it and saw that this was pretty large, about as big as a bus. And as he got up to it, he saw 2 short figures, and they were wearing very loose kind of bag-shaped uniforms. And he became quite frightened, drove off, told the police, and was clearly frightened. In fact, according to the police, he actually fainted from fear while describing what he saw. And the police did an investigation and learned that several people in the area had reported seeing this craft. Now I'll just quote Ernest directly because he has an interesting description here. As Ernest Delattre says, "I saw it going down quickly, changing color. It finally took on a phosphorescent bluish-gray color and landed approximately 200 meters in front of me, at some 15 meters off the road. I continued to drive, and 10 seconds later, I passed up to it. It was an ovoid-shaped craft of approximately 5 meters in height. No noise. I became frightened because then I saw, just at its side, 2 silhouettes, which resembled potato bags, without defined contour, at a height of about 80 centimeters, who came along on the side of the road. I had the vague impression that there were others of them. Then I accelerated. A little farther along, I looked back. The craft took off and followed me for about 15 meters for a few seconds before it suddenly veered and moved away." 1 day later, another landing. This is crazy. This occurred at Nivelles Nord, October 3rd. It was around 1 a.m. when Monsieur Marcel Sénéchal, a 20-year-old steelworker, was biking through Nivelles and was on his way home. And now the light on his motorcycle, his bicycle, was broken. So he probably could not be seen by anyone around him. Perhaps this is why he was able to approach this craft. because suddenly to his right he heard these voices speaking in a foreign language, and turning to look, he saw a glowing object on the ground not far away. He said it was shaped like a haystack, a description many witnesses give, and it was sending out brilliant beams of light, and standing next to it were very short figures, 2 of them. They were about 3 feet tall and wore shiny, sort of metallic-looking jumpsuits. So as Marcel says in his own words, "I turned my head, and downwards of the way in a pasture, at the pale light of the moon, I saw a ball approximately 3 meters in diameter, and near it were 2 small beings, whose size did not exceed 1 meter. They had large heads. Their clothing was luminous." So he became quite frightened. He rode as fast as he could to the police station in his hometown and returned with an officer to the scene, but by then the craft and the beings were gone, and there was no trace of the craft. So by this time, all of France is talking about this, and it's certainly beginning to spread out across the world. A very intense wave. And the next day, on October 4th, there was 5 landings all across France. This is occurring. This next case comes from researcher Jean Sider. This occurred in Nantes, near the Loire Atlantique. The witness was on his bicycle exploring the river's edge when he heard somebody calling, someone from the bushes nearby. And at first he ignored this call, but he heard more calling and stopped and walked up to this figure and asked him what he wanted. Now this figure didn't answer, but beckoned, gestured for the witness to approach. So with some hesitation, the witness advanced towards this figure, and at this point he could see that this figure was wearing what looked like a brown aviator suit, boots, held in his hand something that looked like a gas mask. But this figure beckoned to the witness to follow him to a nearby field. So the witness was a little cautious, quite amazed, but very curious, and followed this figure through the field and came upon a disc-shaped craft on the ground. Now at this point he became very frightened and wanted to run away, but he said he couldn't. His legs would not obey, and he just stood there stunned, as if in a dream. And the man stood next to him and kind of smiled at him, seemingly amused. The witness described this object as a translucent disc, about 30 feet in diameter, maybe 6 feet in height, and it had on top of it a transparent cupola. And at this point a door opened, and he could see inside this object, and he saw all kinds of bizarre equipment. He saw what looked like a circular table covered with buttons and lit up with green lights. He said this craft rested on 3 landing legs, and he could see what looked like symbols. They didn't correspond to any letters or languages that he was aware of. So this man was still kind of standing there and smiling at him, and at this point spoke to the witness in French, but with a strange accent, and told him not to be frightened, that he wasn't going to be harmed, and told the witness that he was from another world. And he said, and I quote, "Do not be astonished that I speak your language. Our civilization is much more advanced than yours. We know all about the wars that plague your planet and the ones to come. And it's for this reason that for some time our aircraft have been flying over your world." And he continued, he says, your weapons tests worry us. We fear for the peace of the solar system of which your Earth is a part of. If another world war would start, we would intervene. Any attempt of destruction would be stopped and annihilated by means unknown to your science. We hope that we will never have to intervene. So at this point, the figure stopped talking, walked towards the
saucer craft put on his helmet, kind of saluted the witness, and entered into the object. The door slid closed without a sound, and the saucer lit up in yellow. The witness heard a whistling noise, and this object rose vertically about 10 meters, 30 feet up. The landing gear retracted, and this object moved slowly, gaining altitude, then suddenly darted off, disappearing from sight. This is one of few cases in which the humanoids actually spoke. I think this could be one of the clues as to why this wave was taking place, as I will discuss when we get to the end of this incredible wave. But it's still going on the same day, October 4th, still 1954. This case comes from Jacques Villet and involves a 10-year-old witness by the name of Eliane Berthaud from Villers-le-Tilleul. And Eliane had just led the cows to pasture and was returning in her moped when she saw, some distance to her left, what she first thought was a metallic tent. But as she got closer, she saw a door kind of coming from the top of the object, and she could now see that this object really looked much more like a egg-shaped object, and it was resting on the ground. So the door was about 3 feet high, much smaller in width, 2 feet perhaps. And it was then that a small humanoid appeared from the doorway, jumped to the ground. On his head he wore a large helmet, kind of square-shaped, but she could see that he had piercing eyes. She could see his arms. It was wearing a uniform that she described as being sort of russet red. And this humanoid figure started to move towards the witness, and she ran away absolutely frightened. But as it turns out, there was another witness in the same area, Antoine Barras, a 70-year-old gentleman, saw this object, apparently the same one, as it rose from the ground and disappeared. Still the same day, in a different area, Topignac, France, October 4th, 7:30 p.m., 3 witnesses were driving on the GC40 road and saw a red glow off to the side. They stopped the car. About 700, 800 feet from the road, they could see this dome-shaped saucer. And I'll just quote the witness directly as he says, "We then realized that it emanated from a circular object approximately 6 meters in diameter, a luminous dome of orange-red color. It was motionless. At some 20 meters of altitude, we did not hear any noise. Quite suddenly, it started moving laterally, flew over a small wood, and disappeared from our sight. However, we still saw the gleam. We thought it had landed. One of us remained close to the car to alert potential additional witnesses, while my comrade and I left in the direction of the light. We progressed approximately to 400 meters before seeing the machine again, and near it we saw 4 small beings, whose size was approximately 1 meter, who were busy with a mysterious work. Surprised, we stopped for a few seconds, then we resumed our walk the most silently possible. But we were not any more than 15 meters from them when the 4 characters located us. They circumvented the machine and disappeared, and almost at once, the machine was wrapped by a succession of blue, orange, and red lights. We were completely dazzled. The machine then took off at a frightening speed." So we're seeing the same pattern again. These craft land, they're usually saucer-shaped, egg-shaped, shaped like a haystack, and there's these short 3-foot little figures who are walking around and then dart back in. It's very strange. Same night, October 4th, another witness, Monsieur Garot from Chailly, saw a UFO that he said was about the size of a car, shaped like an upside-down soup bowl on his property, and he saw 2 essentially human-looking men who he says were wearing what looked like khaki-colored overalls. They walked up to him and shook his hand and asked him, Paris? Nord? Now these are towns, of course, in France, cities. Now he's not exactly sure what they said, but that was his impression. He had his dog with him. One of them bent down and actually pet his dog, and they went back into their craft, which promptly took off at high speed. So again, a very strange case, which sounds more like an introduction than anything else. And here is another case. Quite brief. Same night, October 4th, a farmer by the name of Henri Le Harris, 23 years old, from Maigri, this is near the Côte d'Amour. He went outside around 10 p.m. to water and brush his horses, and noticed that his stables were all lit up, so bright that he thought there was a fire. So he approached, and this is when he saw two very short figures, and behind them a craft landed on the ground. It wasn't big, about 8 or 9 feet wide, resting, as we often hear in these cases, on 3 landing legs. The two figures darted inside, the craft promptly took off, and the next day, in the morning light, he could see a prominent mark on the ground where this object had been. The next day, October 5th, there were 3 cases. So this September, October, I'm telling you, this wave just went non-stop. The witness in this case is André Narcy. He was a road worker for 19 years, 48 years old, father of 7 children. This occurred in Mertrude in the Haute-Marne area. And he had showed up on his motorcycle late for work, and his fellow employees could see that it was quite shook up, and asked him what was wrong. And he said that he had come upon a craft. And I'll just quote Andre directly, because this case got a lot of attention. As Andre says, it was 7:15 a.m. while I was riding. I was approaching a place where on my left in the fields I saw something of an orange color. I thought it was a canvas on the ground or the tent of a camper, but suddenly my heart shocked, and I realized it was a machine. I stopped, put my bike against the barrier, passed under the barbed wire, and ran into the pasture in the direction of this thing, the machine that was posed on the ground at the bottom of a basin where once the clay was extracted for the tile factory. By now I had only seen the flying saucer's top, but it now appeared to me in full. I was about 100 meters away and began to distinguish all the details when I saw a person standing next to the craft. He seemed to me entirely covered with hair, or else he wore a tight coat of fur, and around his waist he wore a sort of broad orange corset or belt, and on his head he had a kind of teddy toque, so a sort of weird hat. He was motionless and seemed to look at me. I could not make out his facial features. Suddenly I became aware that I was alone in front of him. I was afraid and stopped running. Making a gesture, I questioned him. Then he rushed into his machine very quickly. I could clearly see when he leaned in to enter through a round porthole that he had arms. I had plenty of time to see this saucer accurately. It was spherical in shape with an approximate diameter of 30 feet. Below the sphere I saw a sort of spindle. The round porthole was between the sphere and the spindle. It closed on the little being, and I saw a kind of smoke from one end of the spindle as there was a big vaporous eddy under the saucer that rose vertically. Everything disappeared very quickly in the clouds. I heard only a kind of rustling comparable to that of an electric motor. So this was the story he told his co-workers, and he returned there with 2 of his co-workers, and all 3 of them saw that the morning dew was dried up all over this area where this craft had landed. The grass itself was flattened and whitened, and there were what appeared to be about a dozen round depressions in the ground. So some really distinctive landing traces. Now the press seized upon this case because at this time everyone was just going nuts, and there were scores of articles published on this case in particular, many of which misquoted the witness badly, some of which attacked the witness quite ruthlessly. And at this point he was getting sick of it and wrote to some of these newspapers, and they kind of responded by saying that he had hoaxed the event as an excuse for being late to work, which is kind of ridiculous considering he's a 19-year employee. And they actually wrote that the police learned from him that he had hoaxed the encounter, that he told the police this. I couldn't find evidence of that, but reportedly the police, according to the newspapers, said that they accused him of having hand-dug these holes in the ground. Of course, there was no mention about the burned grass or the lack of dew and the other witnesses who had verified this. So this became somewhat labeled as a hoax in some of the articles, and some researchers believed this as well. However, years later there was a follow-up. Some researchers interviewed him, and Andre denied ever having hoaxed it, but he said that he was receiving so much attention, he just let some people believe it was a hoax. But he said it had, in fact, actually happened. It's quite an amazing case. And again, not the only one. In fact, there was another one that was right next to this case, very close. Also, on the same night. It was at around the same time, too, 6 to 8 a.m. A witness by the name of Gregoire Oldut, according to some accounts, Odu. He's a 64-year-old farmer. He had just fed his horses and went outside to see if the skies were clear enough to work his fields, and saw a glowing red-orange sphere which dropped from the sky very fast, slowed down, and landed, appearing to bounce a few times. And like the previous witness, he said that this object had a cupola on top, and as Gregoire says, suddenly, behind the curtain of trees of the old tile factory, I saw a gold disc in the sky. Am I dreaming? Not at all. The orange spot plunges from the sky, and after a few leaps on the grass, lands. I could not believe my eyes. A 1 meter tall creature comes out of the infernal machine. Suddenly, the bipedal stranger goes back on board, the apparatus rises, and disappears. So this is remarkable confirmation of what Andre Narcy had seen, because this is right next to it, almost the same exact area. Really quite astonishing case, and again, not the only one on that day. Again, October 5th, this time it's after 4 a.m. This is in this town of Lactudi near Finistère, when Pierre Lucas, a 20-year-old baker, had just exited the bakery to get some well water to make some dough. This is an amazing case. He just filled his bucket with water and turned around to see a saucer on the ground about 15 feet away in the backyard of this bakery. He said it was pretty small, about 9 feet in diameter, and immediately a very short figure, he says about the size of a 7-year-old child, emerged. Pierre was astonished. He dropped the bucket and watched as this little dwarf-like being approached him, speaking in a foreign language, walked right up to him and tapped him on the shoulder. So it was quite dark at this time. Pierre couldn't see this figure clearly, so he kind of turned around and went into the bakery, and to his amazement, this little figure followed him inside. And he could now see this figure clearly. It was just over 3 feet tall, an oval face, very large eyes, about as big as a raven's egg, and a face full of facial hair. And, as Pierre says in his own words, he approached me. Before I could recover from my surprise, he tapped me on the shoulder while uttering unintelligible words. I managed to keep my cool. The visitor followed me into the bakery. In the light, I could stare at him. He had an oval face all covered with hair and eyes the size of a crow's egg. I called my boss, but the Martian, when he arrived, was already gone, and the saucer was gone. So yeah, as this figure walked right into the bakery itself, Pierre shouted, "Boss! Boss! Come see this!" shouting for his boss, Monsieur Le Goff, to come and see, at which point this dwarf turned around, ran outside. Both Le Goff and Pierre went outside, and there was nothing there. In another interview, Pierre gave a few more details. He says, "I went out to go seek water at the fountain. Suddenly I saw a ball of fire which came down from the sky. No noise at all. In a wink, it landed in the meadow on the other side of the road. I distinctly saw the 3 feet which retained it on the ground. A yellow light enlightened the higher part, and it happens that this individual gives me a tap on the shoulder. I saw it as I see you. It had a bearded face, and perhaps he had a mask on his head, a helmet which resembled that of the motorcyclists. Wires like those of the radio antennas came out of it. Frankly, I was afraid. I let my bucket fall. I returned. My boss came out. There was nothing anymore." So this case did get a lot of attention, and there were some who were quite skeptical of it. And in fact, one newspaper actually said that they had solved the case, and that what Pierre saw was actually a trained goat, which had escaped from the nearby circus and wandered into the bakery yard, basically just disregarding all the eyewitness testimony and just trying to explain this case away. So yeah, another just truly bizarre case. And it was day after day after day, all through October, this wave went on. It was in fact the very next day, on October 6th, in the town of Causey, that there was another case. This comes from French researcher Joël Maynard. And as he reports, an unidentified anonymous woman was riding her bicycle and saw an object which was shaped kind of like a turtle with a cupola on top. It was emitting first an orange light, then a green light, which was dimming and brightening. And she saw 2 humanoid forms. One carried a rod in its hand, and the other seemed to be looking for something. She said a purple light from the object was bright enough that she could see these beings clearly, and she saw human-like faces behind the faceplates on their helmets. Now, she couldn't see any nose. She saw only 2 small nostril holes above the mouth, and she couldn't really see their eyes clearly, but it looked like they had only one eye. So probably she just couldn't see it clearly, but it quite frightened her. She screamed loudly, and at this point, the object and the beings disappeared. The object made a humming sound, and it was gone. Very strange case. And it's just day after day after day this goes on. So we're at October 7th now. We'll get to the end of October soon enough. But it was on October 7th in Mendionde. This is the Basses-Pyrénées area. And this was a case which was not investigated so much as published in the newspapers. But the witness is Monsieur Manet Huercercha. He was going to work and saw in a field 2 mushroom-shaped objects about 6 feet in diameter, glowing red, and right standing next to them were 2 little figures, only about 2.5 feet tall, who kind of gestured to the witness to approach, and they were talking in a language he couldn't understand, but they indicated sort of by gestures that Manet should enter one of the vehicles. And at this point, they entered into one of these craft, which flew off vertically. The other craft was still there in the field. So he approached it and saw inside of this craft a 3rd little figure. At this point, the door shut in his face. The object flew off like the other one with just a sort of whoosh of air. and later traces were found in the grass. The grass on this field was crushed down and all yellowed. So again, just a newspaper account that apparently was not officially investigated. Here's another case. Next day, October 8th, 7:30 p.m. at Bois de Boulogne, Lucien Bourdet said he saw a, quote, sphere land next to him. 3 gnome-like beings came out, each 3 feet tall, dressed in luminous jumpsuits and helmets that hid their face. And one of the beings had 6, quote, rotundities on the abdomen. So that was quite unusual, and some newspaper accounts called these rotundities breasts. I don't think the witness said that, but this got a lot of ridicule in the press. Some researchers do believe this may have been a hoax. But there was another much more impressive case on that same day, October 8th. Pornoy-la-Chétive is the location, and 3 witnesses, Gilbert Kolba, age 11, Daniel Hirsch, age 9, and Daniel's little brother, Jean-Pierre, age 5, were roller skating near a cemetery when they saw a UFO drop down out of the sky, land, and an occupant emerged. And I'll just quote Daniel Hirsch, as he says, "In the sky we saw something luminous. It was a round machine of 2 meters, 50 centimeters in diameter, which landed a little in front of us. This apparatus had black, yellow, and white stripes. It rested on 3 feet. We waited a minute or 2, and a man came out of it. He had a lamp lit in his hand, a lamp which launched rays, and in the other hand a luminous object in the shape of a cross. The man had large eyes, a hairy face. He was very small, 1 meter 20 perhaps. He was dressed in black like a priest. He stared at us in the eyes, but we were afraid. We could not move. He said something in a language that we did not understand. When he extinguished his lamp, we ran away. After that, we saw something luminous in the sky, which went away very quickly." And Gilbert confirms that. As he says, "We looked back a little further. The machine, very shining, rose very high and very quickly in the sky. I swear to you that I saw it." So these 3 children were questioned separately and told the same story. Even when they were accused of lying, they became emotional, stuck to their story, and said it was true. And it turned out that there was another witness. 16-year-old Robert Maguin saw this craft from a distance, but he was too far away to see the humanoid. And the kids stuck to their story. They told their teacher. They even told it to the town mayor. It's an interesting case, and absolutely not the only one, because on the next day there were, no surprise, 3 new landings. The first, this is October 9th, comes again from Jacques Vallée. This occurred near Carcassonne in Languedoc. Mr. Jean Bertrand saw a bright metallic sphere land on the road ahead of him. He said the top half seemed to be transparent, plastic-like, and he could see 2 human-like figures standing inside. No sooner did he see it when it took off rapidly, flying to the east. A lot of these are landing right in the middle of the road. Same night, October 9, about 7 p.m., this is near La Vue in Vienne, Roger Bourault said he was outside his home and came upon a 4.5-foot tall figure wearing a diver's suit and helmet, had glowing eyes and a hairy face. It sent a ray of light at Roger, which rendered him paralyzed. No mention of any disc actually being seen in this case, but probably one nearby. There's so many cases. We will get through them. This next case, again, same day, occurred in Briatext, in the Tarn area. The main witness is Jean-Pierre M.E.T. He was a technician and was driving with his 2 cousins along the RN 631 road. And they saw 2 short little figures run across the road and they turned and watched where they walked to, and it was a UFO, which took off straight up. And as Jean-Pierre describes in his own words, "My cousins and I distinguished two small characters, the size of children from 11 to 12 years old, crossing the road within 4 or 5 meters in front of the car, and which jumped in the meadow. Instinctively I slowed down and stopped 20 meters further. Just in time to get out, we saw a large half-spherical disc, rounded at the base, of a diameter of 6 meters approximately, flying away vertically. The machine was of red-orange color and seemed to be sucked up or puffed up, and it disappeared in the sky like a Bengal firework. We had just the time to follow it with our eyes." And as he says, "Believe that it is not a hallucination. We really lived it, and in all objectivity, you can publish what I have just told you." So he gave numerous interviews. In another interview he said, "I suddenly distinguished in the beam from my headlights two small characters who crossed the road within a few meters hardly of my car. I stopped at once, and to our great amazement we saw them take off from a nearby meadow, a large red disc of a diameter of about 6 meters going up vertically. The machine disappeared in the sky in a few seconds." Case after case. Here's a really astonishing one. Same day, October 9th. The main witness is Gilbert Lullet, 13 years old. He was riding his bike in the Herbray area near Loire Atlantique, and it was around 10:30 p.m. He was returning from his uncle's house and came upon a glowing sphere on the ground. Now he was just getting right close to his home when he came upon this, and as he got closer he saw it looked more like a gray cigar. And he got to within about 30 feet of it when a man approached him, put his hand on his shoulder, and said, speaking in French, "Look at it, but do not touch." According to Gilbert, this man wore gray pants, a jacket, boots, a dark gray hat, but in his hand he held this strange glowing purple sphere, very small, about the size of an apple. And this man walked Gilbert right up to the craft, somehow opened a door or caused a door to open, and looking inside, Gilbert could see two small reddish-colored seats, a console or a panel filled with multicolored buttons. The man entered the craft, closed the door, at which point the craft rose upward, shooting off what Gilbert perceived to be flames in all directions. But it was completely silent. This craft rose to about 150 feet, performed 2 loops, almost showing off, and disappeared, as Gilbert says, like a shooting star. Now he rushed home, barely able to pedal because he was so shook up, tried to tell his parents, but they said he was crazy. Now I'll just quote Gilbert directly, as he says, "It was Saturday evening. It was 10:30 p.m. I was on a bicycle. My parents were in front in the car. I arrived to the village when in a meadow on my left I saw an odd object. It was as a ball of fire posed on the grass. And when I stopped, when I saw it up front, it was all in length, but from the side I saw it was round. I crossed the fence of the meadow, and I was within 10 meters of the ball when a man came to me, put his hand on my shoulder, and tells me, 'Look at it, but do not touch.' He held in his hand a ball like a large apple, launching purple reflections. He opened a kind of door, which he closed again with no noise. But yes, there were 2 seats of red color, and opposite them many buttons of all colors. Sheaves of fire started from all directions, at the top, the bottom, on the sides of the craft. It rose up very gently in complete silence and vertically, arrived at 50 meters, turned twice in circles, and then disappeared like a shooting star. Yes, but I had difficulty to pedal, and I could not speak any more. I was paralyzed by the fear." So yeah, they asked him, "Did you tell your parents?" He was telling reporters the story, and he said, "Yes, they called me crazy." So poor kid. was not believed, it's astonishing because so many people are seeing these day after day. October 10th, 2 more cases. Early in the morning, Michel Toutain was driving his moped when suddenly it stopped and would not advance. He says it was almost stuck, and despite all his efforts to push it, it just wouldn't move. So he checked the engine, and this is when he noticed about 500 meters to his right there was a landed sphere, red, with a green upper section, and he could see a cockpit and what looked like 4 silhouettes standing inside. And a light within the cockpit turned on, at first becoming green and then pink, and this object rose, disappeared as it gained altitude, becoming white and then blue. So, as it turned out, there was a second witness who saw this object taking off as well. So, not just Michel, there was another witness who saw it. And it was on the same night. This case comes from Jean Sider, one of the main investigators, when a forest worker, Monsieur Fleischel, and his friend, an Italian contractor, Mr. Antoine X, were in the woods, and they suddenly saw a mysterious machine which landed near the site of a shooting range. And they saw 3 hairy men, very small, come out. One of them walked up to Mr. Fleischel and put his arm on his shoulder, and then left. Went into this craft, which took off without leaving any traces. We keep seeing this. These figures walk right up to these witnesses and put their hand on their shoulder, as if to say hello. And on the next day, 3 more cases, October 11th. We are now in the most intense part of this wave. This case comes from Aime Michel, and this involves 2 witnesses, Henri Galdois and Louis Vigneron, who were driving and felt something like an electric shock, which paralyzed them. At the same time, the motor of their vehicle stalled, the headlights went out, and 50 yards away they could see a cylindrical object. They also saw 3 small figures next to it, making lively movements and gestures, and watched them as they entered the saucer, which flew off, at which point the headlights came back on, the engine started, and the witnesses were able to move again. The last sighting for that evening occurred at 10:30 p.m. The witness is Spirite Stramar, and he was returning home at the crossroads of Fronton and Villemure when he saw a blue object, 2 discs that looked almost as if they were superimposed on each other, resting on the ground, and right next to him were 3 beings, very short, wearing dark gray uniforms, tight pants, and what looked like aviator helmets. So the witness was riding his bicycle. He quickly got off his bicycle and hid behind a tree and watched as these figures seemed to talk to each other, at which point the craft rose vertically with a noise similar, he said, to that of an electric motor. I'm telling you, day after day, these landings are occurring. Something very strange is going on here. It was the next day, October 12th, still 1954, at 6:20 a.m. in the morning, when Yvonne was on her way to work and saw a luminous white sphere drop from the sky, hover over her pathway right ahead of her, about 70 meters ahead, and about 50 meters above the ground. At this point she could see inside because it looked like the object was transparent. She saw 2 humanoid forms dressed like men in one-piece suits. One was slightly taller than the other, at which point this object shot off at great speed, then shot back, returning to the same spot, did this again. At this time, she's only 50 meters away, 150 feet, at which point this object sped away for the last time, and as she passed over the spot where this object had hovered, she was very frightened it would return. But she arrived to work and was absolutely shaken up, and to the point that she had to go see a physician who gave her a sedative And she had a very weird physiological reaction, because following this, her toenails, she said, dried up and hardened and fell off, particularly on her left foot. And she never recovered from this. This was a malady which remained a complete mystery and persisted for the next, get this, 20 years. So very strange indeed. Day after day. And remember, these are not all the cases. I'm just listing the best ones. This next one occurred one day later, October 13. This is from Jacques Vallée. This occurred near Bourassa in Toulouse, and it was around 7:35 p.m. when a Monsieur Olivier and a Monsieur Perrano and a third witness saw a red-colored disc about 12 feet diameter and a 4-foot-tall being close by wearing a diver's suit. He had a large head compared to the body, 2 enormous eyes, and he was wearing this suit which was very bright and shiny, kind of like glass. And according to the witnesses, a sort of misty glow surrounded this craft, and one of the witnesses walked about 20 yards up to it, at which point he became paralyzed. The craft took off, throwing him to the ground, and it rose very fast. And as Monsieur Olivier says, I was not going to run the risk of forgetting the features of the Martian, and those who have had the privilege of meeting them are not so numerous. So right away I drew mine with chalk. And you can see the drawing here, and he said that this figure had a diver's suit, and it was about 1 meter tall, and he wanted to get closer, but was paralyzed. Case after case. On October 14, one day later, there were 2 landings. Something is going on here. This next case occurred in Perpignan. The witness is Figuer Damien, a 56-year-old retired customs officer. So a good witness. These are not all just uneducated farmers. These are people from every walk of life. And he lived at 27 Rue de la Guirigole, and was walking on the parade road near his home with his 2 dogs at around 7:50 p.m. when he saw a large red spherical object land in perfect silence right in the middle of the road, only 90 feet from him. At this point, a tall man in a, quote, diver's suit stepped out. This figure walked all around his craft, at which point Figuere's dogs started barking and running towards this figure. This figure apparently saw the dogs and Figuere himself and seemed to be frightened of them because he jumped back into the craft, which promptly took off. Now Figuer Damien quickly rushed home, his home was right there, and returned with his son-in-law to the location, but found no traces of this craft or this being. But this case was another one which became very widely reported in the media because the reporters were latching onto the idea that ETs can land fearlessly in the middle of the road, but were afraid of someone's dogs. So the press was kind of distorting a lot of the stories here and having fun with them, which is unfortunate because the witnesses are going through sincere, honestly scary experiences. And it was the same night when 2 other witnesses had a really remarkable experience in Toulon. Pierre Repellini, the owner of a restaurant, and his friend Raymond Ottavioni, a Navy engineer, were riding a motorcycle when they came upon a landed UFO and occupant. The man was human-looking, but dressed in a strange grayish-white suit that kind of reminded them of glass wool. So they approached this figure, and Pierre actually asked this man, "Are you a Martian?" And the figure said, "No, I am French. Where am I?" So Pierre answered and said, "You are in Toulon." The man nodded, entered into the craft, which took off with a loud hissing sound. Apparently not a Frenchman, because the men were interviewed by police, and in particular Navy officers who took this case very seriously, and at the area where this craft had landed, they found a large circle of burned grass. I'm telling you, there's got to be a reason for these landings, as we'll get to shortly. On October 15th, 2 more landings. One occurred at Londinière in the Seine Maritime area. It was around dusk when Robert Henry, or according to some cases, Henry Robert, he's a veterinarian. He was driving along the National Road 214 between Menière and Londinière and was in the town of Bagnolet when he saw 4 flying saucers darting around about 900 feet overhead. One broke formation swooped down over his car, causing his car to momentarily lose control, and he felt an almost electric shock. And at this point, looking ahead of him on the road, he saw illuminated in his headlights a small being about 3 to 4 feet tall. At this point, his headlights started malfunctioning, turning on and off by himself. He could now see a 9-foot-long cylindrical craft, which darted off to the north in 1 second. So he reported this to the police the very next day. And it was around the same time, not far away, on Route 216, when there was another case. This is just outside of the city of Vauchelles-les-Domart, when a witness saw a bright light pass over the road and then land beyond in a small group of bushes in a freshly plowed field. And the witness, Mademoiselle S., who was driving, stopped the truck, and she and the Monsieur Lordel ran into the field to investigate. And this is when they saw 4 or 5 figures, again about 3 feet tall, walking in single file from right to left directly into the bushes, not more than 75 feet away. So frightened, they turned around and ran into the truck and drove off, called the police, who went to the area but were unable to find any landing traces. So amazing. On the next day, there were, get this, 4 landings. I promise we're almost done here. It was 6 a.m., October 16, when a Polish immigrant and stonemason, 61-year-old César K., was pedaling his bicycle on the road through the fog, and he was about 100 meters from a railroad crossing when he saw to his left, 150 meters away, a strange humanoid figure, about 4 feet tall, 4.5. Surprised, he slowed down his pace, and he then saw this individual walking towards a flying saucer, kind of an upside-down bowl, quite small, maybe 3 feet in height, less than 3 feet wide, or rather 6 feet wide. And according to César, the figure itself seemed taller than the actual object. The humanoid entered into this object and sat in a visible chair. And as soon as he had sat down in this chair inside the machine, it went slowly off the ground, rose up about 90 feet, rose up farther without emitting any sound at all. At this point, César panicked and quickly pedaled away from the area. Same night, October 16, near the Livry-sur-Seine area, 2 women, Mademoiselle Rouault and Lebrun, were walking with their children through the woods in the afternoon when they saw what looked like a hairy creature lying directly across their path. They said it was brown in color, round hairy head, no ears but very sharp eyes. Now this did appear to be a sentient, intelligent creature because, as Mademoiselle Rouault says, he waved his arm to us twice, but we weren't reassured. We didn't dare to walk past him, and we made a detour of nearly 2 kilometers to avoid him. I don't know whether it was a Martian or an orangutan. In any case, I have never seen such a creature. He was lying on his forearms near a tree trunk. His head scared me horribly. It was round, earless, with 2 extremely sharp eyes. I will never forget that look. So she immediately reported it. Local farmers converged on the area with rifles, but they found nothing. And newspapers, of course, reported on the case, saying that perhaps she had seen an escaped orangutan. There were, of course, no known escaped orangutans at that time. So, I don't know. There was 2 more cases on that day. This one got a lot of attention as well. Still October 16, Gilbert Mosin, a butcher, was driving with his wife Rena when they came upon what they first thought was a car accident. And as Gilbert says in his own words, and I quote, "About 10 meters from where something was actually happening, my headlights went low. In the passing, my wife and I had time to detail this something, in this case, a bizarre apparatus, posed on the ground between the ditch and the road. It had no wheels and no headlights. Inside, a dazzling clarity reigned, and in front of this craft, it seemed to us, was a man, not very tall, but wide. According to Gilbert, this figure wore a suit, and he looked very much like the Michelin Man in the tire commercials. Had boots and a helmet, was about 3 to 4 feet tall. They could see him in the doorway of this craft, which was glowing very brightly. Gilbert wanted to investigate further, but his wife Rena became frightened and insisted that he continue driving. So this is an interesting case because there are a number of cases involving this Michelin Man type ET, but he told this story later and his friends didn't believe him, so he made a bet with them that it happened, and they went back to the scene and stopped at the place, and as he says, we noticed several small holes forming a circle inside which the grass was flattened. I believe in secret craft. So, interesting, an endnote to this case, which is unique in the French wave as far as I know. Rena, his wife, said she saw the same figure later at the foot of her bed. What we're not seeing in these cases is anyone being taken on board. So that, I think, is significant. Same night, October 16, in the L'Espar Médoc area, a teacher, a geography and history teacher, was driving along the road and saw in the bushes an orange light, stopped his vehicle and got out and walked closer on foot and came up to this object, which was about 15 feet wide, round, landed on the ground. At that point, he saw a 3-foot-tall being in a diving suit, which walked right up to the witness, emitted this weird phrase which he couldn't quite make out. And then the entity returned into this craft through a kind of porthole, and this craft took off straight up. So another ET just coming to say hi. So day after day. October 17, Corbière, France. The main witness, Maxime Pignatelli, 65 years old, was hunting quail along the banks of the Durance River. I actually covered this case recently in another episode. He was shooting at quail when he saw a black oval object about 12 feet across. On the top section, he could see a dome with 2 small childlike beings wearing helmets. And as these beings got out, he ran off, became frightened, panicked, and ran into a ditch, soaking himself up to the neck. But his dog, protecting his owner, ran towards these beings. But moments later, Maxime saw his dog running back, howling in fear, and dragging back its 2 back legs as though they were paralyzed. And as he left this area, Maxime said he felt this absolutely unnatural, overwhelming tiredness sweep over him. So much evidence in these cases: animal evidence, physiological evidence, landing trace evidence, electromagnetic effects. It's undeniable that something very profound is going on here. And here are just 2 more cases that I would like to present, and then we'll wrap it up. This next case, 2 more actually, occurred on October 18th. And Andre Vasseur and his wife were biking when they saw a red object drop to the ground at super high speed. right over a hill ahead of them. And as they came over this hill, they were on their bikes, she screamed because there was this figure standing right next to her. I mean, feet away. And her head immediately filled with pain. Her legs became paralyzed. And Andre, her husband, I'll just quote him, as he says, "I saw it too, but I did not have the force to scream. It had 1 meter approximately, of human shape, but squat, the head capped with a helmet inserted in the shoulders. Its eyes struck me. A pencil of orange light color escaped from them, which followed us. My wife did not have any more the force to shout. She fell, losing consciousness. I raised her, and holding the 2 bicycles in my hands, I fled. If it had happened upwards on the hill, I would have been unable to continue on my way." So they did call the police, who investigated the area and found strange footprints. Now, one more case. Again, same evening, October 18th, at Lac de Saint-Point, Mademoiselle Marie-Louise Bureau was driving her motorcycle when she saw a man in a bright suit crossing the road right in front of her, followed by 2 short dwarfs. So she drove on and glanced behind her and saw this glowing object rising up. This frightened her, so she continued driving off at top speed. So there you go. I mean, I am not really even sure what to make of this super intense wave. And what I didn't talk about was the absolute craziness that was going on at the time. Newspaper reporters were going wild over this. Skeptics were losing their minds. There was a virtual panic in some places in France during the middle of this wave. I mean, there was an incident where a gentleman was actually attacked by his neighbor who thought he was a Martian. In fact, he was just trying to repair his car at night in a field. He had pulled over and he was shot at. There was another gentleman who attacked his neighbor, thinking he was an alien. There was a case involving some teenagers who came running to the town, thought they saw ETs out in the field, and a good portion of the town came running out there with scythes and pitchforks to attack these ETs, who turned out to be nothing but very tall flowers with frost over the blossoms, swaying in the breeze, looking like short little glowing humanoids. I mean, there's case after case of this kind of thing where people are completely losing their minds. Policemen, their cars, the sirens were being mistaken for UFOs. So we had reporters dressing up as ETs and people dressing up as ETs trying to hoax reports. So it became quite a mess. And that's why a lot of the reports, I think, are not super reliable, and we have to be really careful at the cases. So you can make up your own mind about a lot of these. It's clear something very profound happened there. There's far too many cases to ignore. Many credible witnesses, multiple witnesses, lots of physical evidence. There were, in fact, photographs taken of UFOs during this time. But why? That's the main question. I mean, that's what interests me. What went on in France at this time that caused this major UFO wave? And looking into it, there was a lot of research going on in 1954 in France and frankly across the world into magnetics and gravity and electromagnetism and how it relates to the Earth. So this could be a clue. And in fact, I found a quote from Stephen Greer, who says flat out that we learned how to master gravity in October of 1954. I find that a little interesting tidbit. But I think ultimately one of the main reasons, and I'm speculating here, but it's undeniable because CERN was actually founded in October of 1954 and set up in France. This is a nuclear research organization, and we know from first-hand contactee accounts that the ETs are very concerned with our use of nuclear material and our research into it and the abuse of it.
So the fact that CERN was basically opened in October of 1954 might be a strong correlation as to why this wave happened. And I think for me, the biggest takeaway and the really most obvious conclusion is that this was a display. This was meant to be seen. I don't see how you can avoid that conclusion because there's just so many cases of these ETs being seen by so many people. So it's perhaps a combination of the ETs coming down and observing our own research, and at the same time letting the world know that they know of our research into nuclear power and materials and all of this stuff, and that they're concerned about it. So perhaps that's the reason behind the French wave of 1954. But whatever the reasons, and you can make up your own mind about it by just looking at the cases, it's an incredible series of events, an unprecedented wave of UFO and ET activity that we really haven't seen before or since. And for that reason alone, I think everyone should educate themselves and learn about this amazing UFO wave. That's why I wanted to do this video for you today. I almost feel like I need to apologize because it's so long and so many events, but I really felt like I wanted to cover it in as much detail as I possibly could. So thank you for watching. I truly appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it and perhaps learned something. But until next time, keep asking questions. Keep searching for the truth. And most important, keep having fun. Bye now.